A Passing Storm by Lu Xun, translated and read by Peter Rambo. Upon the muddied ground by the riverside, the sunlight gradually faded. The tallow trees drew breath, and at the feet of the flowers mosquitoes hummed and danced. Smoke from the peasants' chimneys thinned, and the women and their daughters stood by the doorway, sprinkling water on the ground. It was time for dinner, and tables and chairs were being put out. The elderly and the men sat on stools, fanned themselves, and began to chat. The children came out running or knelt under the tallow trees playing with stones. The women brought out dried vegetables and egg-cooked rice, thick, rich, and steaming. Some scholars passed by on a pleasure boat, drinking and feeling inspired by this picture of rural beauty. They said, "No fears, no worries, here is true freedom and happiness." But the scholars were quite wrong. They hadn't hold old Nine. She was furious and hitting one of the stools with a fan, saying, "I've been alive for 79 years. That's long enough. I'm not going to watch this family ruin itself. I'd rather be dead. We're about to eat dinner and you're stuffing yourself with roast beans, eating us out of house and home." Her great-granddaughter, 6, was clutching some beans. She'd been running back home, but when she saw what was going on, she ran right back to the riverside and hid behind a tallow tree. She stuck her head out between the curtains of her hair and yelled, "You old bat!" Although 9 was old, her hearing was good. Still, she hadn't heard what 6 said. "Every generation is worse than the last," she muttered to herself. There was a special custom in this village. After a woman gave birth, they named their children according to how many jinn they weighed. After celebrating her 50th birthday, old 9 had become critical of everything. She said that when she was young, the weather wasn't so hot and the beans weren't so hard. Nothing about the world now was right. What was more, 6 weighed 3 jinn less than her great-grandfather and 1 less than her father. This was irrefutable evidence. So once more she said, "Each generation is worse than the last." Just then, Mrs. 7, her daughter-in-law, came over to the table and threw down a basket of rice, saying angrily, "This again? When 6 was born, she actually weighed 6.5, didn't she? Your scales are off. If you used the right one, 6 would have been more than 7. I don't think father or grandfather really weighed 7 or 8 jinn. Perhaps they had even worse scales then. Each generation is worse than the last." Before Mrs. 7 could answer, she saw her husband, Mr. 7, suddenly running up from the harbour. Directing her anger at him instead, she said, "Why are you so late? Did you come back from the dead? Don't you care that everyone's waiting for you to start dinner?" Although Mr. 7 had been born in the village, he had always had high aspirations. From his grandfather down to him, for 3 generations, not one of them had lifted a hoe. Every day he'd worked on the boat. Early in the morning he left for Luja, and every night he came back. Because of this he'd learned a lot. Where the thunder god had struck down a centipede spirit, where a young woman had given birth to a demon, and other things like this. He was already very well known in the village. To preserve the family customs, no lanterns were lit in summer. This meant if he was home late, there was going to be an argument. Mr. 7 came over carrying a pewter bowl and a long spotted bamboo pipe with an ivory tip. Hanging his head, he slowly sat down on a stool by the table. 6 took the opportunity to slip over beside him. She spoke to him, but he didn't answer. "Each generation is worse than the last," old 9 said. Mr. 7 slowly lifted his head aside and said, "The Emperor's back on the throne. He's back in power." Mrs. 7 was still for a moment, and then suddenly realizing what this meant, she said, "Well, that's good. That means there'll be a general amnesty, doesn't it?" Mr. 7 sighed again and said, "I don't have a queue." "Does the Emperor want people to have queues?" Mrs. 7 asked. "He does." Mrs. 7 felt worried. "How do you know?" she asked hastily. "Everyone in the Shenheng Hotel says so." Mrs. 7 felt there was something ominous about this. The Shenheng Hotel was a reliable source of information. She glanced over at her husband's bald head. With feelings of anger and hatred she couldn't control, a sudden wave of despair came over her. She shoved a bowl in front of him and said, "Come on and eat. Is crying going to grow you a queue?" The last rays of sunlight receded. The water's surface began to cool. Over the muddy flats came the sound of chopsticks against bowls, and a few beads of sweat dripped down everyone's backs. After Mrs. 7 had eaten 3 bowls of rice, she raised her head. Her heart began racing uncontrollably. Beyond the tallow trees was the short and fat figure of Zhao coming over the plank bridge. He was wearing a sapphire blue gown. Zhao was the owner of the Maoyuan Hotel in the neighbouring village. He was considered an exceptional person for many miles around. He carried with him a learned aura and was something of a scholar. He had more than a dozen copies of Romance of the Three Kingdoms annotated by Jin Shatang. He would often sit reading it word by word. Not only could he recite the 5 names of the tiger generals, but even knew that Huanzhong was also known as Han Cheng and Mao Chao was Meng Qi. After the revolution, he had curled his head upon his head like a Taoist priest. He would often sigh and say that if Zhao Zilong was still alive, the world would not be in such a bad way. Mrs. 7 had good eyesight, and gazing into the distance, she could tell already that Zhao's hair was not up like a priest today. The front of his head was bald, and his black queue was hanging down. She knew this must have been because the Emperor was back on the throne. Her husband was in danger. Zhao had only worn his gown twice in the last 3 years. Once when an enemy, had fallen ill, and once when Lu, who had smashed up his hotel, died. This was the 3rd time. This meant he had something to celebrate, and his enemies had something to fear. Mrs. 7 remembered 2 years ago her husband had called Zhao a bastard when he was drunk. She knew he was in trouble. Her heart began racing even faster. As Zhao walked over, everyone sat eating rose to their feet. They indicated with their chopstick to the food and said, "Come and join us, please." Joe nodded his head and said, "Carry on, please," and went straight to Seven's table. Everyone in the family greeted him. Joe smiled and said, "Please, keep eating, please." He looked over their dishes carefully as he passed. "Oh, the food smells great. Did you hear the news?" Joe asked, facing Mrs. Seven. He stood directly behind Mr. Seven. "Yeah, the Emperor's back on the throne," Mr. Seven said. Mrs. Seven watched Joe's face and forced herself to smile. "Now the Emperor's back on the throne, there'll be an amnesty, right?" "An amnesty? An amnesty? Eventually I should think so, yes." Joe's tone turned more serious and he said, "Well, what about Mr. Seven's queue? This is a serious matter. You know, during the Taiping Rebellion, if you lost your hair, you lost your head. Lose your hair, lose your head." None of the Sevens had ever read a book. They didn't understand the historical reference. But they knew if someone learned like Jail said such a thing, the matter was serious. It was like a death sentence. A buzzing began in their ears, and they were unable to speak. "Each generation is worse than the last," Old Nine said, using the opportunity to utter her grievances to Jail. "Nowadays, the rebels cut off people's hair. Don't know if they're Buddhist or Taoist. Were the rebels like this before? I've lived 79 years. It's long enough. Before the rebels, they wrapped their hair in red satin that hung all the way down to their heels. The prince had yellow satin. It went all the way down, yellow satin, red satin, yellow satin. Oh, I've lived long enough, 79 years. Mrs. Seven rose to her feet and said, as though to herself, "What are we going to do? Everybody depends on him." Zhao shook his head and said, "There's nothing you can do. No cure, that's a crime. It's written down very clearly. It doesn't matter how many people depend on him." When Mrs. Seven heard it was written down, she lost all hope. There was nothing she could do. Suddenly, she directed her anger at her husband. She pointed her chopsticks at the tip of his nose and said, "That corpse brought it on himself. During the rebellion, I told him not to take a boat. I told him not to go into the city, but still he wanted to go. He had to go. And in the city, they cut off his queue. Before, it was a perfect crow-black queue, and now he doesn't look like a Buddhist or a Taoist. He brought this on himself, and now he's dragging all of us into it. He's a criminal, a living corpse." Seeing Zhao arrive, everyone in the village finished their food quickly and began to gather around the Seven's table. Mr. Seven knew they were making a scene, and being insulted in public like this was an ugly sight. He began to raise his head and said slowly, "You've got a lot to say about it today, but at the time, you're a living corpse, a criminal." Among the onlookers, the kindest was Mrs. Eight. She was cradling her 2-year-old son, whose father had died before he was born. Looking on the turmoil, she began to feel sorry for Mr. Seven. Trying to calm everyone down, she said quickly, "Mrs. Seven, don't worry about it. People aren't gods. No one knows what will happen in the future. And when the queue got cut off, didn't you say it didn't matter? Also, no one from the government has given us any official notice yet." Before she'd even finished listening, Mrs. Seven's ears went red and she turned her chopsticks towards Eight and said, "What are you talking about? Don't I look like a rational person? Would I have said such nonsense? When his hair was cut, I cried for 3 days. Everyone saw it. Even that little monster Six was crying. Six had just finished what was left in her bowl, and she went to reach for more. Mrs. Seven pointed her chopsticks in between the hair on her fringe. "Could you make any more noise, you little brat?" The empty bowl fell from Six's hand, landed right on the edge of a brick and smashed. Mr. Seven stooped down and picked up the bowl. He examined it and shouted, "Stupid girl!" and struck Six on the face. Six began to cry, and Old Nine took her by the hand. "Each generation is worse than the last," she said as she led Six away. Eight was furious. She shouted, "Hitting a child? How could you?" Zhao looked on smiling, but ever since Eight had mentioned that the government hadn't put out an official notice, he felt irritated. He moved around the table and said, "Who cares about hitting children? The army will be here soon, led by the warlord Zhang, and descended from the legendary General Zhang Yidu from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. He holds a giant spear and can take on 10,000 soldiers. Who's going to stop him?" He lifted up his hands as if carrying a giant spear and lunged towards Eight. "Could you stop him?" Eight was hugging her son and trembling with rage. But seeing Zhao's staring eyes and sweat-covered face, she felt a shock of fear. She couldn't bring herself to say anything more and got up and turned away. The crowd felt Eight was to blame for starting trouble. Many of the men who had begun to grow their queues again hid at the back of the crowd, hoping Zhao wouldn't see them, but Zhao wasn't paying them any attention. He slipped through the crowd, and as he crossed over the plank bridge to leave, he turned and called, "Do you think you can stop him?" The villagers stood around blankly, thinking over what had happened. They knew none of them could stop General Zhang. Mr. Seven's life was over. He was breaking the Emperor's laws. And they all thought on how he had come back from the city, telling them news, smoking and looking arrogant. It gave them pleasure to see him fall. They wanted to talk about it, but they didn't know how. After a while, the mosquitoes flew past their bare arms and chests and swarmed back under the tallow trees. The villagers returned home too, closed their doors and went to sleep. Mrs. Seven grumbled as she gathered up the chairs and table, and then she too went home to sleep. Mr. Seven picked up the broken bowl and sat on his doorway to smoke. He was so worried he forgot to inhale, and the tip of his bamboo pipe slowly faded out. Although his situation looked grim, he kept thinking over options in his mind, trying to figure a way out, but his thoughts just ran into a muddy track. Queue, giant spear, every generation is worse than the last, the Emperor's on the throne, bowl will have to be fixed in the city, who can stop him? It's clearly written down, you little brat. The next morning, Mr. Seven took his boat into Lujan early and sailed back as usual that night. He carried with him his bamboo pipe and pewter bowl. As they sat eating dinner, he told old Nine the bowl had been 3 coppers per rivet to fix. They needed 16, so it cost 48 in total. Old Nine said unhappily, "This generation is worse than the last. I've lived long enough, 3 coppers for 1 rivet. What was it before? I've lived 79 years. Mr. Seven continued to sail into Lujan as he had done before, but his relationship with his family had worsened. Most of the villagers avoided him and never came to ask him news from the city anymore. Mrs. Seven used an unpleasant tone with him and often called him a criminal. After 10 days or so, Mr. Seven was sailing back into the village when he saw his wife looking particularly happy. She asked him, "What did you hear in the city?" "I didn't hear anything." "Is the emperor on the throne?" "No one said anything about it." "Even in the Shanghai Hotel?" "No," Mr. Seven said. "I don't think the emperor's on the throne," Mrs. Seven said. "Today I went past Zhao's hotel and I saw him sitting by his books. His queue was up on the back of his head and he wasn't wearing his gown." "I think it must be because the emperor's on the throne, right?" "Yes," Mr. Seven said. "I think so." These days, the villagers once again treat Mr. Seven with the same polite respect they once did. In summer, when he and his family sit upon the mudflats eating dinner, everyone smiles and greets them. Old Nine celebrated the longevity of her 80th birthday. She's just as healthy and full of complaints. Six's forked fringe has grown into a ponytail. Although her feet have been bound, she still helps her mother as she can. She carries with her a bowl filled with copper rivets and limps as she walks.